The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the worn wooden floors of James Morrison's apartment in the French Quarter. His fingers absently strummed his guitar's strings as he watched the notification hologram floating above his coffee table pulse with an urgent blue light. The International Xenological Exchange Program's logo spun slowly, accompanied by text that made his heart skip a beat. Immediate notice, emergency placement required. Participant Diplomatic Envoy Naxira Vel Soren. A species Celestian. Arrival today 1800 CST asterisk. James set his guitar aside and ran his fingers through his dark, curly hair. When he'd applied to the housing program months ago, he'd never actually expected to be selected. Musicians weren't exactly prime candidates for hosting interstellar diplomats. The hologram chimed again, this time displaying a brief profile. Celestians, a species known for their crystalline-based biology and complete emotional control. Their homeworld, Celestia Prime, was apparently a gas giant's moon where the aurora never ceased. A soft knock at his door made him jump. He glanced at the time, 1759. When he opened the door, the hallway light caught on something that seemed to shimmer like mother of pearl. It took his eyes a moment to adjust to the sight of her. The Celestian stood exactly his height, her skin a translucent crystal that seemed to capture and reflect light in impossible ways. Her features were eerily human-like, but with an ethereal quality that made her appear almost carved from living opal. Her eyes were the most striking, solid white, with pinpricks of light that moved like stars in a nebula. Envoy Naxira Vel Soren, she stated, her voice carrying an odd resonance like wind through crystal chimes. I presume you are James Morrison. He managed a nod, stepping aside to let her enter. Just James is fine, welcome to New Orleans. She moved with precise, calculated steps, carrying only a small metallic cube that he assumed was some kind of advanced storage device. Her clothing was equally alien, something between a jumpsuit and flowing robes, made of a material that seemed to shift colors with each movement. Your dwelling is, she paused, those star-filled eyes scanning the room, disordered. James felt his cheeks warm as he looked at his apartment through her eyes. Musical instruments were everywhere, his beloved guitar, a keyboard, various percussion instruments he used for street performances. Sheet music covered most flat surfaces, and the walls were lined with old vinyl records. I'm a musician, he explained, clearing some papers from the couch. This is kind of my studio too. Music, she spoke the word as if testing its weight. A primitive form of sound manipulation for emotional effect. Primitive? James couldn't help but laugh. I guess compared to interstellar travel, yeah, but there's nothing primitive about how it makes people feel. Her head tilted slightly. Celestians do not feel, we process, we analyze, we conclude. Emotion is inefficient. James picked up his guitar, an idea forming. Mind if I test that theory? Without waiting for her response, he began to play. Not anything complex, just a simple Spanish guitar piece he often used to warm up. His fingers moved across the strings with practiced ease, drawing out a melody that spoke of summer evenings and distant dreams. He watched Naxira as he played. At first, she stood perfectly still, but then, so subtle he almost missed it, her head tilted just slightly. The lights in her eyes seemed to shift, following the movement of his fingers. When he finished, she spoke immediately. An interesting sequence of vibrations. The mathematical patterns are quite precise. That's all you got from it, no feeling at all. I observed, I analyzed, that is sufficient. But she was still staring at the guitar, those stellar eyes fixed on the strings. Well, James set the instrument aside, your room's this way. It's not much, but it's got a view of the courtyard. The spare room was small but clean, with large windows that let in the late afternoon light. Naxira placed her metallic cube in the center of the room, and with a gesture, it expanded into various pieces of furniture and equipment he didn't recognize. This will be adequate, she stated. I must inform you that my presence here is not merely for cultural exchange. I am conducting research on human emotional responses and their impact on decision-making processes. James leaned against the doorframe, so I'm basically a lab rat. You are a test subject, yes, though I fail to see the relevance of Earth rodents. He couldn't help but smile. It's just an expression. Look, if we're going to be roommates, maybe we could try being friends instead of researcher and subject. Those stellar eyes fixed on him, and for a moment he thought he saw something flicker in their depths. Friends, she repeated slowly. An emotional bond between individuals, inefficient, unnecessary. Maybe, James shrugged, but most of the best things in life are. Later that night, as James lay in bed, he heard something that made him smile, the softest sound of humming coming from Naxira's room, perfectly matching the melody he'd played earlier. The sound had an otherworldly quality, like crystal glasses singing. Maybe he thought emotions weren't as alien to her as she believed. And maybe, just maybe, this unexpected arrangement would lead to something extraordinary for both of them. Through his window, the stars twinkled above the French Quarter, and somewhere in that vast expanse was Celestia Prime, a world that had sent him a mystery wrapped in crystal skin, a mystery he found himself increasingly eager to understand. 2 weeks had passed since Naxira's arrival, and James found himself constantly surprised by his crystalline roommate. She developed a habit of standing perfectly still in the corner of his living room while he practiced, those star-filled eyes tracking every movement of his hands on the guitar strings. One muggy morning, as James prepared for his regular street performance in Jackson Square, Naxira emerged from her room wearing what appeared to be an attempt at human clothing, a flowing silver dress that somehow complemented her translucent skin. "I wish to observe your public music ritual," she announced, her voice carrying that familiar chime-like quality. James smiled, slinging his guitar case over his shoulder. "You mean my performance? Sure, but it's not really a ritual. You repeat the action at precise intervals in specific locations following established patterns. This meets the definition of ritual." She tilted her head, starlight dancing in her eyes. "However, I have noted that the sound sequences songs, as you call them, vary each time. That's because music isn't about patterns, Nax, it's about feeling the moment." The nickname had slipped out naturally over the past weeks, and though she'd initially protested this inefficient abbreviation, she'd stopped correcting him. The French Quarter was already alive with tourists and locals alike as they made their way through the narrow streets. James noticed how people's heads turned to watch Naxira pass, but she seemed oblivious to the attention. Her focus remained entirely on him as he set up his usual spot near the cathedral. As he began to play, mixing jazz standards with his own compositions, he watched Naxira's reaction. At first, she maintained her typical rigid posture, but as the morning wore on, something began to change. Her crystalline fingers started to tap against her leg in perfect rhythm with his music, an unconscious gesture that made his heart skip a beat. During a break between songs, an elderly woman approached them, dropping a few dollars in his guitar case. "Your girlfriend is absolutely gorgeous, dear," she whispered to James with a wink. Before he could correct her, Naxira spoke. "I am not his mate. I am conducting research on human emotional response patterns through musical vibrations." The woman blinked, then laughed. "Well, honey, you're in the right city for that. Music is the heart and soul of New Orleans." "Hearts are circulatory organs. They cannot produce music," Naxira stated matter-of-factly. James quickly started playing again, hiding his amusement behind a blues riff. But as the morning progressed, he noticed Naxira becoming increasingly agitated. Her crystalline skin seemed to shimmer more intensely, and the lights in her eyes moved more rapidly. Finally, during another break, she gripped his arm. "James, I am experiencing irregularities. The sound waves are creating unexpected responses in my crystalline matrix." Concerned, he packed up his guitar. "Let's head home, you okay to walk?" She nodded stiffly, but her usual graceful movement was slightly off balance. Back in their apartment, she sank onto the couch, the first time he'd ever seen her use the furniture for its intended purpose rather than standing or perching formally. "What's happening?" he asked, sitting beside her. "The music, it creates resonances, not just in the air but in my structure." She held up her hand, and James saw that her crystalline skin was indeed vibrating subtly. "This should not be possible. We Celestians are taught from emergence that our crystalline forms are perfect, stable, unchanging." James reached out hesitantly, then paused. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, she extended her hand. Gently, he took it in his, marveling at how warm it felt, like sun-heated quartz. "You know, crystals on Earth resonate too. Some people even use singing bowls made of crystal for meditation and healing. But I am not a simple mineral formation. I am Celestian. We cannot." She trailed off, her eyes fixed on their joined hands. "Cannot what, Nax?" "Feel," she whispered, and her voice carried a new harmonic he'd never heard before. "Yet when you play, when the sounds move through me, I experience sensations, patterns that have no logical analysis, responses that serve no practical purpose." James smiled softly. Those are called feelings, Nax. Everyone has them, even crystals, apparently. She withdrew her hand abruptly. This is not why I am here. My research requires objective observation. I cannot become compromised. Maybe understanding emotions requires experiencing them, he suggested, reaching for his guitar. Here, let me show you something. He began to play a gentle melody he'd been working on for the past week, one inspired by the way light moved through her crystalline form in the morning sun. As the notes filled the room, he saw her resistance slowly crumble. This sequence, she said softly, it creates a resonance pattern similar to the aurora on Celestia Prime. That's what I was hoping for. I've been working on it for you. Her eyes met his and the lights within them swirled in a new pattern. You created this, for me. Yeah, I wanted to give you a piece of home, but with an earth twist. For several long moments, she said nothing, her form completely still except for a subtle vibration that matched the rhythm of his playing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a complexity of harmonics he'd never heard before. I believe, she said slowly, that I am experiencing what humans call gratitude. It is most unsettling. James laughed softly, continuing to play. Welcome to being human, Nax. I am not human, she reminded him, but her tone lacked its usual certainty. As the afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting rainbow refractions through her crystalline form, James continued playing. He watched as she gradually relaxed, her perfect posture softening, her eyes half closing as the music wrapped around them both. Neither of them mentioned how her crystalline skin continued to resonate with each note, or how the lights in her eyes had begun to dance in time with the melody. Some things James was learning didn't need to be analyzed or explained. Sometimes the most powerful discoveries came in the spaces between the notes, in the quiet moments when logic gave way to something far more profound. And if he noticed a new harmonic in her voice when she bid him good night, one that sounded almost like joy, well, that was their secret to keep. The message arrived during one of James's practice sessions, its harsh electronic tone cutting through his melody like a knife. Naxira's personal communication device projected a hologram that filled her room with cold, blue light. James heard her sharp intake of breath, a sound he'd never heard from her before. Nax, he set his guitar aside, standing in her doorway. Everything okay? She stood rigidly, her crystalline form refracting the hologram's light in jagged patterns across the walls. The message displayed before her was in the geometric script of her people, but her expression, once so controlled, showed something that looked remarkably like fear. The High Resonance Council has reviewed my preliminary reports, she said, her voice carrying discordant harmonics. They are displeased with my research methods. James stepped closer, noting how her typically smooth crystalline surface seemed to have developed tiny fracture patterns. What does that mean? They say I have become contaminated by human emotional patterns. They demand my immediate return for purification. Her stellar eyes fixed on him. James, there is something I must tell you about my people, about why we suppress emotion. She gestured, and the hologram changed to show a world of crystal spires under an ever-shifting aurora. This recording is from our historical archives, before the Great Stillness, when our people still allowed themselves to feel. The scene showed Celestians gathering in what appeared to be a celebration. Their crystalline forms pulsed with light and color, their voices creating complex harmonies that made James's heart ache with their beauty. But then something changed. One Celestian's emotions seemed to surge, their form blazing with intense light. The resonance spread through the crowd like a wave, building to an impossible crescendo until, with a sound that made James cover his ears, the Celestians began to shatter. Our emotions, Naxira explained, her voice barely above a whisper, create resonance patterns in our crystalline matrices. When too many of us feel too strongly, the resonance can build until we literally break apart. This gathering cost thousands of lives. God, Nax, I'm so sorry. James reached for her hand, but she stepped back. After this, the council developed the emotional suppression protocols. We learned to maintain perfect control, perfect stillness. It was the only way to survive. Her voice carried a bitter harmonic. But they never told us what we were losing, never let us choose for ourselves. And now, what's happening to you? She held up her hands, watching as they trembled slightly. Your music, James, it awakens something in me, creates resonance patterns I cannot control. The council says these patterns match those from before the Great Stillness. They fear I will shatter, or worse, that I will contaminate others upon my return. Then don't go back, James said immediately. Stay here, we can figure this out. You don't understand. The council will not simply let me go. I am proof that their perfect system is flawed, that emotion cannot be permanently suppressed. She turned to face him fully. They will send retrievers. James ran his fingers through his hair in frustration. There has to be another way. What if? What if the problem isn't emotion itself? What if it's about learning to control it, not suppress it? Naxira tilted her head, the lights in her eyes swirling rapidly. Explain. Look at human musicians. We feel deeply when we play, but we've learned to channel those emotions, to express them safely through music. What if your ancestors had it wrong? What if the solution isn't suppressing emotions, but learning to express them in harmony? She was silent for a long moment, her form still except for the subtle vibration that had become constant since she'd begun listening to his music. An interesting hypothesis, but testing it could be fatal. Or it could free your entire species. He stepped closer, and this time she didn't back away. Nax, I've watched you these past weeks. You're feeling things, real, powerful things, but you haven't shattered. Maybe because you're learning to express those feelings through resonance with the music instead of fighting them. The council would never accept such a radical theory without proof. But her voice held a new harmonic, something that sounded almost like hope. Then let's give them proof. James picked up his guitar. Let me help you understand these emotions, learn to work with them instead of against them, and if the retrievers come, well, we'll face them together. Naxira's form shimmered, and for a moment James feared she would reject his offer. But then she spoke, her voice carrying a complex melody of harmonics he'd never heard before. My entire life I was taught that emotion leads only to destruction. But these past weeks experiencing, she paused, those stellar eyes fixed on his face. In experiencing you, I have begun to question everything. Is that a yes? It is highly illogical, she said, but her voice carried a hint of what might have been amusement. The risks are immense, the probability of success is minimal. She stepped closer to him. And yet, I find myself unwilling to return to the stillness. Perhaps that itself is proof that emotions are more fundamental to our nature than the council wishes to admit. James smiled. So we're really doing this, teaching a crystalline alien how to feel safely through the power of music. You make it sound like one of your Earth entertainment narratives. But she was resonating with a frequency that he'd learned meant she was pleased. We will need to proceed carefully. The retrievers will come soon, and we must have something concrete to show them. Then we better get started. James began to play, softly at first, watching as Naxira's form responded to the music. First lesson in emotional control, learning to let go. As the music filled the room, neither of them noticed that the fracture patterns in Naxira's crystalline skin weren't spreading. Instead, they were beginning to emit a soft, pulsing light, creating patterns that matched the rhythm of James's guitar, patterns that looked remarkably like the aurora of her homeworld. Outside their window, the sun was setting over New Orleans, painting the sky in colors that reflected off Naxira's crystalline form. And somewhere in the vast distance between stars, a signal was already racing toward Earth, carrying orders that would test everything they were about to discover. The hurricane warnings came 3 days after Naxira's message from home. Category 4, they said, one of the worst to hit New Orleans in years. As James boarded up their apartment windows, Naxira stood perfectly still, her crystalline form reflecting the increasingly violent flashes of lightning. The atmospheric disturbance patterns are remarkably similar to the resonant storms on Celestia Prime, she observed, her voice carrying an unusual tremor. We should evacuate like everyone else, James said, hammering the last board into place. The French Quarter floods badly in storms like this. No, Naxira's response was immediate. The retrievers will arrive within 48 hours. If we leave, they will simply track us to a new location. Here at least we have prepared. She wasn't wrong. They'd spent the past 3 days working intensively on her emotional control, using music to help her understand and channel her feelings. James had never played so much or so intensely in his life, and Naxira had changed. The rigid control was still there, but now it was different, more like a dancer's discipline than a prison. The fracture patterns in her crystalline skin had stabilized, sometimes even glowing with soft colors that matched her emotional state. She'd learned to hum along with his music, creating harmonies that made his heart skip beats. Thunder cracked overhead and the power flickered ominously. James lit the emergency lanterns they'd prepared, their warm light casting moving shadows across the walls. At least we're as ready as we can be. James, Naxira's voice carried a new harmonic concern. If the retrievers arrive during the storm, then we'll deal with it, he assured her, picking up his acoustic guitar. He'd stored the electric one safely away. Want to practice while we wait? She nodded, taking her now usual position near him. As he began to play, soft and low, the storm's rhythm seemed to join in, thunder providing percussion, wind adding its own wild melody. Hours passed, the storm grew worse. Water began seeping under their door despite their best preparations. James played through it all, watching as Naxira's form responded to both his music and the storm's natural resonance. It was near midnight when they felt it, a vibration different from the storm's fury. Naxira went completely still. They're here. The retrieval ship must have been using some kind of stealth technology, because James heard nothing over the storm. But suddenly, their apartment was filled with harsh blue light, and three tall crystalline figures stood in their living room. The central figure stepped forward. Unlike Naxira's translucent beauty, these Celestians were sharp-edged and opaque, their forms an unyielding metallic blue. When they spoke, their voices held no harmonics at all. Researcher Naxira Velsoren, you have been deemed compromised. You will return with us for purification. Naxira stood, her form glowing softly in the darkness. Honored retrievers, I request the right of demonstration. Denied, your contamination is evident. The human's influence must be purged. Thunder crashed overhead, and James saw Naxira's form shudder, not with fear, but with something like resolution. She began to hum, a sound so pure it made the air itself seem to vibrate. What I have learned here cannot be purged, she said, her voice carrying complex harmonies. Because it is not contamination, it is truth. Our ancestors were wrong. Emotion need not lead to destruction. Listen. She turned to James and nodded. Understanding instantly, he began to play not just any song, but the one he'd written for her, the one that mimicked the aurora of her homeworld. As he played, Naxira's hum joined in perfect harmony, and her form began to glow with shifting colors that danced like the northern lights. The retrievers stepped back, their rigid forms vibrating in response. Stop this, the resonance is controlled, Naxira interrupted. Through music, through understanding, through acceptance rather than suppression. Observe. She stepped closer to James as he played, her glow intensifying. The retrievers' forms began to shimmer in response, colors bleeding through their metallic surfaces. Impossible, one whispered, but their voice carried the first hint of harmony James had heard from them. Outside, the storm reached its peak. Wind howled through the French Quarter's ancient streets, and rain pounded against their boarded windows. But inside their apartment, something miraculous was happening. As James played and Naxira sang, the retriever's rigid control began to crack, not in the destructive way of the great stillness, but like ice melting in spring. Colors swirled through their forms, and their voices, when they finally joined the harmony, carried emotions that might have been buried for centuries. The music built to a crescendo that matched the storm's fury, but there was no shattering, no destruction. Instead, the resonance created patterns of light that danced between all of them, human and celestian alike, in perfect, controlled harmony. When the song finally ended, the apartment fell silent except for the storm's continuing rage. The lead retriever stepped forward, their form now swirling with colors that betrayed their shaken state. This changes everything. Yes, Naxira agreed simply, it does. Before anyone could speak further, a massive gust of wind slammed into the building. The boards over one window cracked, and icy rain burst into the room. James leaped up to secure it, but his foot slipped on the wet floor. He barely had time to register that he was falling before Naxira caught him, her crystalline arms wrapping around him with surprising warmth. Their eyes met, and in that moment, with rain soaking them both and thunder shaking the walls, James saw emotions in those stellar depths that no amount of suppression could ever erase. The retrievers watched this display with evident fascination, their forms pulsing with new colors. The council must know of this, one said, and for the first time their voice carried true harmony. But perhaps there is no need for purification. Perhaps what we need instead is understanding. As the storm raged on outside, James held Naxira close, feeling the gentle resonance of her form against his chest. They had weathered one storm together, but he knew the bigger challenge still lay ahead. The council would have to be convinced, and centuries of fear and control would not be easily overcome. But for now, in the heart of a hurricane, surrounded by beings of crystal and light, James simply played his guitar. And Naxira, the girl who had been taught never to feel, sang with all the emotion her crystalline heart could hold. 1 month after the hurricane, James stood before the High Resonance Council on Celestia Prime. The crystalline spires of the capital city rose around him like frozen music, and the ever-present aurora painted the sky in colors that reminded him of Naxira's eyes. The council chamber was designed to prevent resonance, its walls somehow absorbing sound and emotion alike. But they couldn't stop the subtle hum that seemed to emanate from Naxira as she stood beside him, her form glowing with controlled confidence. You claim, the chief resonator's voice was as sterile as the chamber, that this human has discovered a way to safely experience emotion through primitive sound patterns. Not discovered, Naxira corrected, her voice carrying the complex harmonies she no longer tried to suppress. He helped me remember what our people once knew. Music is not primitive, it is as fundamental as the resonance that forms our very beings. She gestured, and the retrievers who had witnessed their demonstration during the hurricane stepped forward. Their forms still showed traces of color, hints of emotion they had not fully suppressed since that night. Show them, Naxira said softly. James lifted his guitar, the same one that had weathered the storm with them, now bearing a few water stains that only added to its character. He began to play, not the gentle melody he'd first created for Naxira, but something new. Something that incorporated both human music and Celestian harmonics. Naxira's voice joined his guitar and the retrievers added their own harmonies. The sound filled the chamber, creating patterns of light and resonance that danced through the air. The council members stiffened in their crystalline seats, but they couldn't stop their forms from responding to the music. This is dangerous, one council member declared, but their voice wavered with unexpected harmony. The great stillness was a tragedy born of ignorance, Naxira interrupted. We did not understand how to channel our emotions then. We responded with fear, choosing complete suppression over understanding. But there is another way. As if to demonstrate, she let her resonance build, her form glowing brighter and brighter. But instead of shattering, the energy flowed through her in controlled waves, creating music that made James's heart soar. Impossible, the chief resonator whispered, but their rigid form had begun to shimmer with color. No, James spoke for the first time. Not impossible, just forgotten. Your people have an amazing gift, the ability to turn emotion directly into music to create harmony from feeling. You've spent centuries afraid of that gift, but look around you. The council chamber had transformed. Light and color swirled through the air as more and more Celestians in the audience began to respond to the music, their long-suppressed emotions emerging not in destructive resonance, but in controlled, beautiful harmony. We have documented every step of the process, Naxira continued. How music can be used to safely experience and express emotion, how resonance can be channeled rather than suppressed. We can teach others. The chief resonator rose, their form now swirling with colors that betrayed their inner turmoil. And if we refuse, if we determine this experiment too dangerous to continue. Naxira's glow dimmed slightly, but her voice remained strong. Then you will lose me. I cannot return to the stillness. I cannot unknow what I have learned about emotion, about music. She turned to James, her stellar eyes swirling with lights that he had learned to read as love, about connection. A murmur of harmonics rippled through the chamber. The chief resonator was silent for a long moment, their form shifting through various colors before settling into a soft, iridescent glow. Perhaps, they said finally, and their voice carried the first true harmony James had heard from them. It is time for our people to learn a new song. The decision, when it came, was not what anyone had expected. The council authorized the creation of a new exchange program, not just Celestians studying humans, but humans coming to Celestia Prime to teach music. And at its heart would be a new institution, the Academy of Harmonic Resonance, with Naxira and James as its first instructors. It won't be easy, James said later, as they stood watching the aurora from the balcony of what would become their new home, teaching Celestians to feel safely after centuries of suppression. Naxira's form shimmered with joy as she turned to him. But we have something they never had before, a bridge between our worlds. Your music, my resonance. Together they create something entirely new. James smiled, reaching for her crystalline hand. Where once he had felt only smooth, cool crystal, now he felt warmth and subtle vibrations, the physical manifestation of emotions she no longer tried to hide. Speaking of new things, he said, picking up his guitar, I wrote something for the occasion, want to help me test it out? Her response was a hum that carried such pure happiness it made the air sparkle with light. As James began to play and Naxira added her harmonies, their music rose to join the Aurora's dance. Around them, the crystalline spires of the city began to glow with soft colors, as if the entire world was learning to feel again. And somewhere in the vastness of space between their worlds, perhaps the stars themselves listened to this new song, this harmony of human and celestian, of emotion and music, of two hearts learning to beat as one beneath an endless dance of light. For in the end, love truly did transcend planets. It just needed the right song to help it find its way home.